Hello everyone, and welcome to another Lens Studio tutorial. In this video we are going to cover how to dynamically change different effects within Lens Studio. Until recently, most of the effects I've created have been triggered with an event. Now, an event is something that is built within Lens Studio to detect when a user interacts with the lens. So this can mean anything from opening their mouth to raising their eyebrows, or even when they switch their cameras. So I recently figured out that you can calculate the amount a user has opened their mouth and pass that number into different properties to change the effects in real time according to the user's input. So let's show you an example here. So I added a few face insets here, and I am passing in the size of the mouth distance to a text label to dynamically change that number, just to kind of visualize what that number is. So let's start a new project and let's do this from scratch. Alright, so let's just change this to a photo for now, since we're not calculating anything yet. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is add a couple face sprites, and this is how we're going to track the object on the face. So if you see here, it's adding the face object binded right to the center of the face, but what we're going to do is we're going to move it down to the upper lip. And I'm just going to put it right at the top of the upper lip there, and then zero out the X position on the head. 'Cause really what we care about is the Y position. And then, just so that we don't see that default image, I'm going to set the alpha to 0, because all we're using this for is a reference in our script. So now that we have our upper lip binding, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate that, and we're going to attach this other one to the bottom lip, and we're going to call this lower lip, or just lower. We're going to do the same thing for the sprite, and we'll do the same thing for this one as well, just for simplicity's sake. So just so that I can make sure that I'm taking the right one, I'm going to disable the upper lip binding, and I'm going to grab this lower lip binding and move it down here to the bottom of the lower lip. Again, make sure the X is at 0, and then we'll enable the upper lip again. So now we have our two objects that we are going to reference in the script. So let's create our script. And let's just call this mouth. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm just going to call it that. Now what we need to do first is input those scene objects into the script. So to do that, we're going to do the input command, which is \\@ input. And then we're going to specify what type of object we are inputting. We're just going to do a generic scene object. Make sure the S and the O are capitalized. And then we're going to name that object. We'll do this first one named upper. And then let's just copy that and rename this one to be lower. Once we apply those changes, we're going to add a empty scene object. Name that one mouth as well, because this is where we are attaching the script. Make sure that that is selected in the objects panel, and then drag the script in here. You can also just add it by clicking add component and script. Now you can see it's asking us for the upper and the lower objects, so let's add those in here. So we have our upper binding and our lower binding. Actually, it might be easier to input the sprite, because that was what we moved. Now we have our upper and our lower invisible sprites in the script, so we can reference them. So let's start by getting those positions, just to make sure that we are doing it correctly. And in order to get their positions, we need to grab the transform of each of them. So to do that, let's create a couple variables. Let's call this one variable upper, and we are going to do script.upper, so we are now referencing this object. .get transform. Now if we left it at this would just get the object's transform, and the transform holds information like the object's position or the rotation. So if we left it at that, that's all it would do, but what we want to do is get the object's position in the scene. So let's do .get world position, and make sure that you're typing everything with the case sensitive letters, so you know, like get transform is capitalized, and then the world and position is capitalized in that. And because these are functions, we're going to add the opening and closing parentheses. So let's add a semicolon to complete that command. Let's copy that and create the same variable for the lower lip. So let's rename this one variable lower, and then let's reference the lower object here. So now we have these two positions ready to reference. Let's print it out to make sure that it works. So let's do print, and then we'll first print the string upper, and then upper equals space, and then end that string, and then we're going to add to that string the upper dot y. So what that means is it's grabbing the upper position, but it's only grabbing the y vector. It won't print anything. It doesn't print a 3D vector, so you have to specify whether you're getting the x, the y, or the z value. All we're interested in is getting the vertical distance, so that's going to be the y value. So let's close this print function, and let's copy that and do the same thing for the lower one. Let's just rename this lower equals, and then lower.y. And once we click print, it's going to give us the position here. So we have the upper at 0, the lower at negative 4.7. So that's good. So all we need to do now to calculate the distance between these two is just subtract them. So let's create a variable called distance equal to upper.y. So we're getting that upper y vector minus the lower y vector. And we'll just delete one of these, and we'll do distance equals distance. So now it's telling us it is this far apart, the upper and the lower lip. This has a pretty long string of numbers here, and that can be kind of computationally expensive. So we want to round that number to, let's say, the nearest tenth. And in order to do that, let's create a variable called rounded distance. And we're going to use the math.round function, which is built into JavaScript, to round that number. So we're going to type math.round, and then in parentheses we're going to put in that distance variable times 10, because we want it to go to the 10th. And then type that divided by 10, and then let's pass in rounded distance to that print statement. So now it's going to be 4.8. Perfect. So now we have that distance. Let's test it out and see if it works in real time. And in order to do that, we need to call it every single frame. So we're going to want to create an update event. So let's search update event, one word, in the Lens Studio API. We'll click on that. Scroll to the bottom, and then we'll copy the event in the little code snippet. And let's paste it right here. Delete everything inside there. We don't need that. And then let's take all of that code that we just wrote and put it inside the update event. So now this is going to start calling once every frame. It's going to really clog up the logger here, but you'll see what I mean. So now the distance is 2. Well, that's a little weird. Let's see what happens when we open their mouth. There we go. See, now the distance is changing. It's 4.4 when he opens his mouth, and now it's only about 1.7 when it's closed. Okay, so now we know that it works. Now we know that we have the distance, we have the number. But how do we pass that into different effects? So the first one we're going to try and pass it into is a face stretch. Let's just add a face stretch in here. First, let's go back to an idle person here, and let's disable the script so it's not just constantly printing out that number. Or you know what? Actually, let's just delete the print statement. We know it works, so now we don't really need to see that being printed all the time. Okay. So now let's add a face stretch component to the camera. And then let's just mess it up a little bit here. Yeah, look at that. That's a beautiful face. Perfect. Oh man, that's okay. Alright, so if you look here, this is the feature is what we're going to be changing. Because once you lower the feature, it kind of, makes the effect a little bit less noticeable. The higher it is, the more crazy the effect is. So the feature was at 1. This is like the max that we want it to be. So we're going to need to pass this distance number into the feature right here. So to do that, let's go back to the Lens Studio API, and let's search face stretch visual in the API. And let's click on that. And if you go down here, this is what we need. We need to set the feature weight. That's basically the intensity of the feature. And it kind of gives you a snippet here. This is how you do it. So they create the variable feature to be the string feature 0, which is this one right here. if we wanted to do another feature, we would make it feature 1 as the string. So it takes two parameters, the feature that you want it to affect, and then the intensity of that feature. So let's do that in here. Let's copy this, and let's paste it in our script here. Okay, so now script.faceStretch equals set feature weight. Let's first input that face stretch exactly how it's typed there. So we're going to input component dot face stretch visual, and then we're going to call it face stretch just like it's typed. And then because we're only using one feature, we can just set that to feature 0. We don't really have to change that at all. What we're changing is the intensity. So this is where we're going to pass this rounded distance. But before we do, I want to note that there's a max and a minimum on this face stretch. So it can only go as high as 2 and as low as -5. And if you try and go any lower or higher than that, it just won't work. So we're going to need to set some limits to what this distance can be. So let's start by adding some if statements. So let's say we want it to just be a minimum of 0. So let's say if the distance is less than 0, we're going to want to set that back to 0. So let's say, well, actually it needs to be the rounded distance. Sorry about that. If the rounded distance is less than 0, then let's set rounded distance equal 0. And then let's do the same thing for if it's above. Actually, let's do it if it's above 1, because that's kind of as high as I wanted the effect to go. That looked pretty good on its own, yeah. So let's go back to the script and do if the rounded distance is greater than 1, then rounded distance equals 1. Okay, perfect. So now we have our minimum and our maximum in there. So now let's just pass rounded distance into that. Once we apply that, we're going to need to first make sure that the stretch is set in the inspector on that script. And let's enable this. Okay, so if you can see here, it's maxing out. So why is it maxing out? Well, if you remember, the distance was already pretty high. It was above 1 to begin with. So we may need to do a little manipulation with the number here. Let's try dividing the rounded distance. So let's create the variable final distance. And let's set that to rounded distance minus 2. So hopefully what that'll do is that will kind of set the distance to less than 0 so that, you know, there's nothing happening initially until they open their mouth. So let's copy the variable and let's change the if statements and the number to that. So now all of them are going to be passing the final distance. There we go. So now once we subtract that distance, it's going to be less than 0 for the most part. It's actually still a little bit too much. So let's go 2.5. There. Now nothing's happening when their mouth is closed. But now let's see what happens when they open their mouth. There we go. See? Now you can see that every single frame, it's going to be setting that feature weight to whatever the distance is between the top and the bottom lip. And one thing that you want to consider when you're working with update events is the frame rate. Now, everybody's phones and devices are going to have different frame rates depending on what kind of hardware they have. So it's a good practice when you're working with the update event to add a timer, essentially, to calculate the amount of time between each frame and basically normalize the frame rate no matter what device you're using. So to do that, let's just first create a time variable. Variable time equals 0. Then in the update event, what we're going to want to do is every single frame we're going to want to get how much time has passed since the previous frame. And that's going to be using the getDeltaTime functions. We're going to add that number to the timer every single frame. So time plus equals, which is basically a short way of saying time equals time plus. So time plus equals get delta time. And then we're going to want to create an if statement in here. If time is greater than, and let's say 0.1. So every 10th of a second, this is going to be called, and then we're going to put everything inside that if statement. And then at the very end of that, once that whole thing is called, we're going to set the time back to 0 and start the counter over. So you shouldn't see too much of a difference here, but what this is going to do basically is make it run just as smoothly on a slower iPhone as on a faster iPhone. And to kind of visualize what I mean by this, let's set the number just to 1. So once I set this to 1 and I apply it, you'll see that the transition between the face stretch is much less smooth. So watch what happens here. Yeah, see, it just goes right away because it's going every single second instead of every 10th of a second. So let's go back to 0.1, and it's going to go much smoother. All right. So now we've kind of done that with the face stretch. Let's try it with something else. So let's add some Liquify components, a little face Liquify here to make their eyes crazy. Okay, so first thing we're going to need to do is add these Liquify visuals into our script. Input component dot liquify visual, and we're going to call this one left, and we'll copy this and do the same thing for the right eye. Okay, so let's go back to the API and look up Liquify. Make sure we're in the API Liquify visual, and the numbers that we're going to need here is going to be the radius and the intensity. So let's see, the way that they're doing this is they're grabbing the component and they're literally setting intensity and radius. So that's the numbers that we're going to be changing. If you look at the liquefies here, the radius makes the circle that is liquefying much bigger, and the intensity makes the basically, makes it much more defined. So these should probably be fine at where they are. And let's add these into the inspector in the script. Go there, it doesn't really matter which one is which. Okay, so now let's add a little bit here. Script.left.radius. And if you look at the numbers here, these are both above 2. If we were to set them to 1, they would actually look the exact same. That's the default value. So let's try actually just passing in the rounded distance instead of the one where we subtracted 2.5. So dot radius equals rounded distance. And then we'll do the same thing for the intensity, and then we're going to copy both of these and then just do the same thing for the right eye. Oop. There we go. Right and right. Okay, so once I hit apply here, okay, so it is kind of maybe too high. Oh, you know what, because it also, we're not checking these if statements for the rounded distance. So actually, let's go back and try this. Except what we're going to do is we're just going to multiply this number by 2. So you can always just manipulate the numbers and kind of use a little bit of arithmetic to kind of adjust for whatever works for you. Okay, is that working? Doesn't look like it's working. Let's comment this face stretch out. That might be kind of obstructing it. Yeah, okay, so it is working. Oh, I know why it's not looking like it's working, because it's rendering after the face stretch. So if we want this to work under the face stretch, let's just drag it right there. There we go. See, now it's working. That's why it was acting weird. Perfect. So now we have the Liquify visual on there. The next thing we're going to do is work with a post effect. That is a really cool way to fade in post effects dynamically. So let's add a new post effect in here. Let's add a rainbow one. That should be pretty pronounced. Yeah, look at that. That's cool. Let's just set the alpha to 0 here. All right. So let's first, like the other ones, input that post effect. Input component dot post effect visual post. All right, and let's go into the API and search that post effect visual. Here we go. And then scroll to the bottom for the snippet. All we're going to need here is the main pass.base color. This is where we are going to change the alpha value. So under all of these, let's add that in here. So script.postEffect, let's just change that to post because that's what I named mine right here. So the main pass is grabbing that, and then it's allowing us to grab the base color, which is now passing the RGB and the alpha values in the form of a vector 4. And the one that we're interested in right now is the alpha, which is the last one. So let's do the final distance, because this is just like the face stretch where we don't want it to go above 1 or below 0. Let's make sure everything else is set to 0 except for the alpha. And then once we apply that, oh, can't get main pass because we probably didn't. Yep, we need to set that in here. There we go. Oh, well, that is not how we wanted. So maybe it's because we need to apply final distance to every one of these. Let's try that. There, yes, okay, I was wrong. So you need to set every single vector to that number so that it scales up properly. Look at that, that is beautiful. So now we can apply that same concept to sprite visuals and like face masks too. So let's try adding a sprite visual in here. Let's just add a face sprite. What should we add in here? Let's just add this post effect. Yeah, that's a good example. And let's see. Let's make that a little bigger. Yeah, there we go. Let's set the alpha to 0. So now we want to change that alpha of that sprite visual. So let's input that again into the script. Input component.sprite visual. We'll just call it sprite. Good. Make sure that we have that. Oop, I must have done something wrong here. Oh yeah, that was spelled incorrectly. There we go. So let's grab that sprite visual here. Okay. Then we're going to basically copy this and kind of recreate that. So we'll go here, script.sprite. And that's all we need to do. There, look at that. It's changing the alpha dynamically. It's changing everything dynamically based on where their mouth is. Well, that about does it for this video. I hope you learned a little bit here, and if you have any suggestions for anything else you'd like to learn in Lens Studio, go ahead and comment. And also, I would love to see your creations. I want to see what you guys could make with this. You know, the possibilities are endless. So go ahead and post your snap codes in the comments as well. I would love to see it. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great night.